right. Hello, everyone. Hope you are doing well. I just need to organize a few things here. I'm a little late. All right. All right, people asking in the chat already, asking if Jordan Peterson will be at the ARC conference. And I don't really have a direct, I don't really have an answer, but I personally don't expect him to be there. It would be great if he was, but I think he still has a bit of ways to go still. Okay, I have this really weird thing that's happening in the chat. For some reason, the chat is being automatically translated. What is happening? What? The chat is in French, folks. This is really, really weird. How do I stop this? So everybody, you guys all speak French. Yes, look at that. Isn't it crazy? Yeah, someone says, La Tour de Babel est arrivée. In fact, probably writing in English, saying the Tower of Babel is there. How do I stop this? I have no idea. Oh my goodness. This is very annoying. One of the most annoying things is when you know someone and you know them in English, and then all of a sudden you're speaking a different language to them. It's very odd. Like I can never talk to my wife in English, for example, even though she speaks perfect English. It's just very weird. All right, let me just see here if okay, so for some reason, it's just the normal chats that are translated, but the super chats aren't translated. I guess they don't want us to translate super chats. All right, okay, I'm gonna figure out later how to do this. Sadly, I'm gonna have to interact with all of you in French, I guess. Maybe I should just do it in French, and that way we'd all be on the same page. Maybe, who knows? Maybe if I do it in French, then YouTube will translate it back into English for you, and so that's just how wild this happened to, though. Like my mother, she said she saw a clip of me and she wasn't sure where it was. She thought maybe it was on Facebook or something. And she said the clip was in French. And she said, but it wasn't your voice. It was as if it was someone else speaking through your mouth, but it was in French. And I can never find that. So I don't know what was going on. All right. All right, so as you know, the way this works is people who support the Symbolic World, $10 or more per month, they can ask questions in advance, and the questions, I will find them on the Circle Symbolic World community. And then for everybody else, you can show up in the chat, or you can obviously ask questions there. I will try to pay attention to the super chats, especially, but also keeping my eye on the general chat as well. So yeah. All right. And I mean, if I read some of your questions in the chat, I will have to retranslate them into English as I'm reading them in French, and therefore you might not hear the question that you asked. So yeah. All right. Yeah, someone saying that YouTube takes for granted what language you speak. Yeah, for sure. This is something that happens. You know, So Kaizen Snake writes in all caps, I am the second Messiah. And the question is, are you French Messiah or an English Messiah? I don't know. All right, all right, all right. Okay, so a lot of things have happened since I talked to you last. We had the Symbolic World Summit, and it was really amazing. I mean, I don't know if there's some people in the chat who were there. It was I think it was better than the last time, to be honest. And the reason was because it was more like a big kind of family gathering. We made sure this time that we had a lot of places where people could just sit and hang out and have lunch and meet with each other, and it felt like people were really connecting. And so to me, that was very precious. And the speakers, all the speakers did such a great job. And one of the things several people told me is that they felt like this time coming out of the summit, they they had a sense of what they could do, right? They had a sense of how they could apply it in their life and what it is that they could do. Mary Harrington's speech was really astounding. Deacon Seraphim's also was so well prepared and really took us through, the difference between the ancient hero and the modern hero, and the difference between the cults of the heroes in the past, and our reverence, for the saints today. Just amazing stuff. I felt like actually my speech was the one that was the least well prepared and like well put together of all of them. It was more like a kind of inspirational kind of speech, I guess, is what I did. But anyways, so it was really great. You can still get it if you want. I think it's like $100 for to get the entire 2 day, 2.5 day thing with the Q&As and all the different speeches. So if you're interested in that, you can go ahead and get that on the Symbolic World website. And for some reason, and I don't totally understand what's going on, is that I came back from the Symbolic World Summit, and I don't know. I mean, it was a mix of things, I guess, but I just for some reason started to go into kind of Christian apologetics on Twitter, and I've posted several things, and I keep telling myself, Jonathan, stop. What are you doing? What is this? This is not you. This is someone else. But I don't know why I can't stop just posting different Christian apologetic stuff. So you know, it's yeah, it's weird. So all right, here we go. Let me start with the Symbolic World platform. All right, I am going to stop. So Daniel Linton for 7 likes. What is the upper room? I noticed you referencing it in your Rapunzel book. It made me realize I had never thought about its significance in the Pentecost story. Is there a connection between Rapunzel and Pentecost? And so, yeah, well, I mean, the upper room, this is at least my understanding, it has to do with the fact of something, especially in the story of scripture. Like if you imagine if you had a castle, imagine like even a skyscraper today, who's in the top floor? The person at the top floor is you, the person that has the most money, the person that has the most influence. In the same in a castle, why would you, in the would you have the castle, the king in the basement of the castle? Usually not. If you have the throne room, it'll be up above, it'll be high up, in the castle, a place that is above everything else. And so I think that's what it is. It's about hierarchy, and it's about events happening in the upper room. In some ways, are in the story ends up being events that form the rest. And so, right, this Holy Spirit comes down on the disciples, and then they imagine they're at the upper room. The Holy Spirit comes into them, and then they go out, they go down, and then they speak in the different languages down below. And so it's related, and that's why this whole anti-Babel idea of Pentecost, of how it's kind of like a reverse image of Pentecost. In some ways very similar to what happens at Pentecost, right? The wind of God comes. There's an ancient tradition that's not in scripture, but even in Jewish tradition, that talks about how like the Spirit of God, the wind of God blew, and that's what made the Tower of Babel fall. But now the wind of God comes down and then changes the one language into multiple languages, but not in confusion, rather in love and in expression. And so I think that's all related to what the upper room is. That's my sense. Wow. So someone, Ocean Blue Monster, says, advice for a Jewish person in Israel who wishes to convert to Orthodoxy. I mean, I would say you're at the center. You go to the Holy Sepulchre. You're definitely in the place. This is the place where there is still very much a center there. That's what I would suggest. You could go there and maybe talk there with some of the priests or some of the deacons or some of the people there. There's also a really wonderful Russian monastery that is on next to the Garden of Gethsemane. I forget who it's dedicated to. That's horrible, but that might also be a place to go if you're in Jerusalem. All right, okay. So let me do some super chats and see. All right, so start with. All right, so Disciple 111D question on behalf of my mother. Do we know the women who Cain and then Seth procreate with? Seems like a missing link in the narrative. Thank you, sir. Well, you could watch our recent video that Deacon Seraphim and I did on the what is the Cave of Treasures, which is a later tradition, but in some ways kind of deals with that. In the idea is, at least in these traditions, some of the Syrian traditions, which is obviously the people that were there, like the descendants of the Jews and the Samaritans of the first century, they became a lot of the people, the Palestinian people that are there, some of the Syrian Christians that are there, those that spoke Aramaic, all these people are descendants from the early Christians. And so they have this tradition, of course, that, they are the sisters of, they also came from Eve. And so there's this wonderful tradition about how Eve, each son is born with a twin sister. And so Cain has a twin sister and Abel has a twin sister. And in this particular tradition, the idea is you're going to marry the twin sister of the other, right? So Cain is born with his twin sister, and then he is called to marry Abel's sister, and then Abel is called to marry Cain's sister, but Cain is in love with his own twin, and it's a kind of a nice image of, first of all, although it's weird because it's all incest in our estimation, but you can understand how in this context it's like a relative degrees, right? Where in some ways the sin that you can receive with the sin of Cain, which is in some ways to be in love with himself, to be too in love with himself, and to see in his twin sister the one towards which he should come. And so he refuses to marry Abel's twin and wants to marry his own. And this is actually part of the fall of Cain. It ends up being one of the reasons why he kills Abel. And so there's some definitely interesting things to think about there. And so obviously, it doesn't say how many girls Eve had in the story, who knows? And it also doesn't say how many sons she had either, That's also, she might have had more, you don't know. All right. And so let's see here. All right, so Dorothea K on the platform for 6 likes. She says, "Hi, Jonathan. What is your take on the meaning of the 3 Marys under the cross? I can't imagine that there is no meaning behind 3 women with the same name being at the feet of the cross." Thank you, as always. Yeah, the whole idea of the 3 Marys is definitely something which has a deep meaning. I know St. Gregory Palamas did a whole thing about that, and then in some ways, the different Marys, they exemplify different aspects of the Mary, of the waters below. And so that's the way that I tend to understand it, is that, there's this image of Mary of Bethany, who is a repentant woman, of Mary Magdalene, who is who had several demons chased out of her. So you have really, and that all kind of, Mary of Egypt, for example, which is not in scripture, but it ends up kind of coalescing towards, you could say, the 2 aspects of potential in terms of feminine. There's a difference between the potential that is virgin and the potential that is saturated. So you have Mary, who is the virgin, and then you have the bitter Mara, right? This idea of the bitter water is the one that is saturated in images like Mary Magdalene, or Mary of Egypt, or Mary of Bethany, the repentant woman, you could say, right? And so it's the bitter repentant woman, the bitter woman that repents is different from the virgin. The Mary is pure. And so these are the different aspects, I think, of Mary, why there are all these different Marys in scripture. Although I haven't totally worked it out in my mind, but it seems to me like it's a kind of suggestion. And yeah, and so even I know that St. Gregory Palamas even uses these suggestions to find the mother of Jesus in places where it's not clear that she's there. Like, it's not directly said, that it's somewhat hidden in the text. Is this idea that although there are places where Mary, the mother of Jesus, isn't named specifically through these other Marys, it's like almost like a secret hint that she's there, right? She's participating in the event. And so, yeah, that's how I tend to see it. All right, let's see. Oh, another super chat. Noah Joeldi asks, "What is the symbolism of North-South Korea? Capitalism dystopia versus communism dystopia. South Korea lowest birth rate and highest suicide rate." Yeah, I mean, I think it's for sure it's a stark example of the two extremes, and how, and it's something that we should learn from, for example, because the truth is that, and some people will be very annoyed with what I'm about to say, but the truth is that Christianity is not a capitalist system. Christianity is not a capitalist belief. Christians should not be pure capitalists. And it's the same. Christianity is also not a socialist kind of communist type of thinking. It just isn't. It has a idea of personal individual responsibility, but it also has this important idea that we should care for the widow and the people that are weak. And it's an interplay between those two. And what you see in North and South Korea, which is important, is that, especially, you see that in Western Christians. This is something that happened to me recently, by the way. A woman who's a wonderful woman that I really I thought was admirable. She was doing all these different projects, but one of the projects she was involved in was funding these documentaries in Iran. And this was kind of like before the war, like as the war was kind of on the horizon, it hadn't started yet. And she told me about how they funded this documentary about a kind of punk rock type, whatever, screamo band in Iran. And she was very happy to say, like, we're funding this rebellious teens, these rebellious kind of screamo bands in Iran. And this woman was a Christian. And I couldn't help myself. Usually I don't say things like that, but I asked her, I said, and so what, right? Is that what you want for Iran? You want us to paint them rainbow and make them like us? Right? So that they don't have children anymore, so that they become degenerate? Like, is that your answer to authoritarianism, right? Is degeneracy. And this is something that America has participated in, right? It's like the answer to autocracy is porn. The answer to autocracy is Disney and consumer culture. And no, it isn't. Like, those two sides are suicidal. And I think North and South Korea are two examples where you see that, where the degeneracy of South Korea is basically suicidal. Like, they will they're just not producing humans and making people that are full of despair. And the autocracy of North Korea is a nightmare, where people live in abject poverty, and there are hundreds of thousands of people in work camps. And so I think it's a stark wake up call for us to think that the solution to, for example, Muslim countries, let's just make them like us. Let's free Iran and make them like us, so that they become degenerate and that they don't have children anymore, and that they, it's like, not sure that that's the solution. You know, I'm not a fan of Islamicism and autocracy, but I'm not sure that making them like us is the solution to that. So yeah, so that's my take on that. That's my take on that. All right, and so Ben Klimek says, which talk from the summit is still hovering in your memory, and what was so compelling about it for you? Why? Uh, I mean, they're just I can't really isolate one. I think that a lot of the talks were just amazing. Daniel Linton in a comment to that says Heather Politan's is the one for me. It was like a crown on Mary Harrington's talk. Yeah, Heather's talk was wonderful because one of the things that I've been trying to do for years, if you go back in my videos, you'll see I do these videos about trying to reintegrate postmodernism. And how do we do that? How do we not just embrace the modernist illusion? How do we find a way to integrate the modern world and the postmodern world into a more complete vision? Which is why I talk about monsters and gargoyles and all that stuff. And I thought Heather's approach in that talk, doing it through art and kind of going back into what it is that the postmoderns say and how does it jive with the more universal vision of the world, was really powerful. And to me it was helpful to also make that clear in my mind, although until now it's been kind of an intuition. And we've been working, Heather and I have been working on the new Sleeping Beauty book. And the Sleeping Beauty book is really in some ways going to be the biggest experiment that we have in the fairy tale series, because it is a fully postmodern story. But hopefully what it is, it's actually taking all the postmodern tropes that we've seen in the past few decades in storytelling and turning them in a manner, it's something like a judo move on postmodernism is what I call it. And so I can't wait for people to read it. And I'm obviously a little worried about how people are going to react, because it does, all the elements of the story in Sleeping Beauty are there, but I play with them in a manner. Anyways, you'll see when you see it. Can't wait for you guys to see it. All right. All right, going back into the super chats. Wayne 1000 says, can you explain the significance of the icon in an icons behind you, both who is being depicted and the symbolic meaning of the style? Oh, so yeah, so these icons here that you see, these icons are St. Andrew Rublev and St. Theodore the Studite. And so, of course, St. Theodore the Studite is the great defender with St. John of Damascus of the icons after Nicaea II, after the Seventh Ecumenical Council. And then obviously St. Andrew Rublev is a saint iconographer. He was canonized not that long ago, but he is recognized as a saint in the Orthodox Church. And so that's why they hold icons. And so yeah, so in terms of the style, I think it does also have to do with what it is that we're talking about. These icons. Man, I'm horrible. Not because I'm forgetting the name of the iconographer. Oh, I should not. I can't believe I need to find it because he's important. He's a. Let me check this here. Sorry about this. Come on, Jonathan. You can do this. I literally have written articles on this person. I'm not going to find his name. He's a Syrian iconographer. Come on. Well, that's it. I'm sorry that I can't remember his name. Anyway, so but what he does is he's on the one hand trying to go back into older iconographic traditions, like the very early images that had a kind of like a naive simplicity to them. And what he's doing is he's also trying to connect that to early modern painters like Matisse, who were willing to explore that kind of naivete in painting. And so I don't know if I would put his icons in my church, for example, but I do think that having them at home has been I find them beautiful, and they have a kind of sensibility that I appreciate. So that's what that is. And so sorry that I couldn't find the name of the iconographer. All right. And so Ian Clements asked, in a walk in the woods, I saw a small buck looking at me from a distance. We watched each other for probably 20 minutes as I slowly approached. My gut instinct was to get as close as he would let me. I probably got within 10, 15 yards. What's the symbolism of the stag? Why it always exciting to come across a deer, even though finding them in the Midwest forest is very common and completely normal. Um, I mean, for sure, the in Christianity, the stag has become a deep symbol of something like noticing the divine logos out in the wild places, right? That is the surprise of finding meaning and purpose and Christ in the wild. And so there are obviously these famous stories of Saint Eustache, for example, who sees a deer, a stag with a cross in his antlers. And this image of the stag that like appears and kind of reveals that wants to be followed, for example, so that it brings you to discover that which is true and holy. That's what it is, right? It's like the fish symbolism in Christianity, which is it's meaning hidden in darkness, right? It's like the surprise of insight, of seeing the logos and seeing the reasons for things. Um, when you don't expect it. And so that's for sure what the stag has been meaning in the deep meaning of the stag in Christianity. But I think that for someone, especially people who don't live in forests, I think that this is the experience that we have when we see a wild animal is something like what I'm saying, which is that you're walking through the woods and, in some ways everything feels static, everything feels like it's there. And then all of a sudden you see this hint, right? This glimmer of something moving, something, out between the trees. And the sense of wonder that it brings us is the sense that the world is alive, right? It's this sense that actually the world is living, and that the world isn't these dead things, even though our perception that the world is dead is an illusion. But when we see a living creature, when we see a rabbit going through the woods, or we see a deer, especially a deer, or like if you saw a moose or a larger creature, it evokes this wonder of realizing that in fact, that this world is full of meaning and purpose. And so that's at least my intuition about why we love to see wild animals in the forest. It's also, I mean, it's related to where we live now, because there are other places in the world where some of those animals, because our world is so domesticated that it evokes in us the sense of wonder. But even in Canada, if you come up against a moose or a bear, that wonder is there, but it turns into terror quite rapidly. And even if you met like a very large stag, and it looked you down, that wonder might just come right up to the edge of a kind of a slight sense of horror because of the danger that it represents. But as I've lived in Congo and in Kenya for several years, and I've had several experiences where you walk right up to a buffalo, and the buffalo just stands there and looks at you, or you find yourself surrounded by baboons, for example, who really want whatever it is that you have. They want the food in your bag, or and then they'll really come to attack you. That is not those experiences are after once you've gone through them, you still have that sense of like wonder and how in some ways the world has a will independent of yours, right? Maybe there's something of that too, but it's a little more terrifying. Yeah. All right. Let's see. All right, so Kei Hashimoto asks, recently I moved back to the country of my birth and heritage, Japan. I felt oddly at peace going to Shinto, Japan's native religion, shrines, finding them extremely beautiful and calming. Even recently started to feel compelled to pray at them. How in the world do I reconcile this with being a Christian? I'm finding myself trying to justify this with the thought that all good things are originally of God. Thank you. Um, you know, I, if you're a Christian, I would definitely suggest that you don't do that. I understand I understand the draw. Like I understand the appeal. I remember reading even C.S. Lewis in some ways expressing that when he was visiting. Let's say the going to Delphi and seeing the ruins of the Temple of Apollo, and feeling in him that that you could say drive to recognize that there's something real, there's something holy there. Um, but I would say that this is, if you're a Christian, this is I mean, I think it's dangerous in general, but it's especially dangerous if you're a Christian. Um, Mostly because you don't know these spirits. Like, what are they? What is that you're engaging with? Um, it's disconnected from from the headship of Christ, not ultimately in a cosmic sense, but in the sense that it's not serving it. And so I would definitely avoid that if you can, and you know and and go to a church, and hopefully in a church you'll be able to have that same experience of reverence, but at least being aligned ultimately to what it is that you believe. Yep. All right. And so here we go. So Samuel Ramalera 7237 um, in the super chats for $5. I don't know what that is. Hi Jonathan. People frequently ask about your symbolic views on Neon, Genesis, Evangelion, Warhammer, and Fullmetal, Alchemist. Any ideas? God bless. Um, I don't really know that much about them. I've never watched Neon Genesis, and I've never played Warhammer. Although Deacon Seraphim, you know, he's several times he brought me to like one of those figurine shops, and I was walking through and looking at all the different like crazy Warhammer figurines. My sense of Warhammer is that in some ways it's almost like it's like everything is in a symbolic loop, right? It's as if it's everything that it's trying to represent gets kind of rehashed and amplified over and over. It's as if they're always asking themselves, you know, so I think like there was one race that's they have this kind of priestly aesthetic, kind of gothic, aesthetic, and so then it's as if it's like, oh, you know, how can I have a giant with like his whole clothing is actually like churches, and then there are like people stuck in the churches, and there are these, it's like these weird, it's like, first of all, there's the whole violence part, but in this rehash, and how can we make it more? Like, how can we take the symbolism and increase it till it becomes so over the top and absurd? That's my sense of Warhammer. And in terms of Full Metal Alchemist, I started watching it with my daughter. And then we watched a few episodes, and and then stopped. I don't remember why we stopped. It was, I mean, it was interesting. I don't know. I mean, one day maybe. Supposedly, Neon Genesis is super long too, and so I don't know. I don't have the energy and time to watch things anymore. It's like I don't really care. All right. So sorry, I'm a little chaotic today. All right. So White Lawrence for 4 likes says, "Why is it that people say time goes by faster the older we get? What's the symbolism there?" I mean, for sure that's true. That's definitely an experience we have. I think that for sure there's something about the wonder of childhood where in some ways you're encountering things for the first time. And so because of that, they have high qualitative value, right? And the high qualitative value is marks your memory, right? And because it marks your memory, then it takes up space in your experience. And so when you're young, you have a lot of these, a lot of new beginnings, a lot of first times, a lot of practice and so because of that, I think that's probably one of the reasons why time is moving slower in your experience. Whereas once you've kind of assimilated everything and you play things out, the things that you do in life have less place in your memory. So as you kind of enter into that routine, living the life, doing the things, at least that's my sense. Yeah, for sure. I think in my case, what's happening though is that in the past several years, I've done so much. I've I've done so much, and I traveled so much, and I've met so many people that I feel like my life has it's weird because it's kind of both, right? It's sometimes you look at the last year and you think, oh my goodness, it feels like the last year was 5 years, you know. Or there's one year where I went to Greece 3 times in the same year, and to London like 4 times, and then it was nuts, like it was crazy in one year, and then there was all these other trips and all these other events and all these things. We published books and we did, you make, it was like 50 something videos and you get interviewed anyways. Um, and then I would look back at the year, and it's true there's a sense that it went fast, but it also feels like it took like it was 5 years of your life. So um, yeah, so at least that's my sense. Yeah, that's my sense. I mean, when people do a lot of things, it feels like life things move slower. Think about Donald Trump. He's only been the president for a year. Is it like a year and a half? That sounds crazy. Feels like he's been president for 10 years with everything that's happened. Every single day is like a new thing. So there's something about that. All right, let's see. I think I'm getting confused here in the super chats. All right, and so Alexander Eason for 200 SAK. I think it's Swedish, right? What is the symbolism of a liar's nose growing, such as in Pinocchio's case? Yeah, I mean, I don't know why it would be the nose in per se rather than anything else. I think for sure the thing that marks me is in some ways the idea that you can't hide it. And so that's the sense. The sense is that the more you lie, the more it becomes apparent, and that there's nothing you can do to hide the fact that you're lying. And so to me, that's really that's my tendency is to think that that's what the Pinocchio story is about. That's why his nose gets longer, is because of that. Is that he it shows. You can tell that they're lying. And you see that with people that lie a lot. At some point, the lies become so convoluted that that they just appear, and someone contradicts themselves, or, doesn't realize they forgot the lie that they told you and then tells you something different. And then that's an example of the lie becoming apparent. So, Mind Hack 2878. How is grace viewed from the Orthodox perspective? Is it God empowering you to be able to overcome sin and do good works? And so in the Orthodox tradition, grace is God himself. That is, grace is the outpouring of God's energies into creation, right? It's the very underlying presence of God's will in the world is his grace. And so grace it's a little different from, so when we collaborate with grace, that is when we let grace transform us, because the grace is in some ways what God wills for us and what God wills for the world. So when we let grace transform us and we participate, right, we synergize with the grace of God, that is how we are deified, right? That's how we are made God, through participation, obviously not through nature, but through participation. And so, for sure, I think for a lot of Western Christians, that's very mysterious. They're not used to thinking of God's grace that way. But to me, when I kind of understood this, and I understood that this is what grace is, it's actually God acting in us and through us. It solved a lot of problems for me, in the sense that it made me understand again, how the world is in God and God is in the world, and God is not removed from the world. That in fact that God is non-dual ultimately, right? That there is no complete duality between God and his creation, that he infuses it. And although it is not by nature uncreated, God's presence infuses everything and is constantly calling it back to himself, right? Constantly calling the world back to him. And so, yeah, and so that's the way that the Orthodox Christian understand grace. And so, yes, it does empower you to overcome sin and to do good works, but it's more than that. It's more than a moral question. It really is that if you participate and if you synergize your will with God's will in the world, then you are being transformed truly, entering into the life of God. So, yeah. All right. All right. So Ioannis Leonardos asked, in the tabernacle and the temple, the Holy of Holies was towards the west, but in Orthodox churches, it is towards the east. What is the symbolism of that inversion? It's a great question. So when the first churches that the Christians built, once the Edict of Milan was promulgated, once Christianity became legal in the Roman Empire, the first churches that the Christians built had the Holy of Holies in the West. And so if you go to Rome today and you go to the early, like, Constantinian churches and the churches that were there that are still standing from the very first centuries, you will notice that the Holy of Holies is in the West. And this is actually the cause of a great confusion in Catholic circles right now, because the fact that the priests in Vatican II liturgy serve towards the people, one of the justifications that they used in their description was that in the early churches of Rome, the priest served towards the people. But the reason why they served towards the people is because they were serving towards the east, is because they were facing east, because of the verse that says that that the Son of Man comes like a lightning bolt from the east to the west, and so that the priest was standing facing the returning Christ, right? Facing Christ that was coming towards them. And that's really the way of understanding, you could say, the symbolism of the West in the tabernacle and in the temple. You can understand it as if it's the receptacle, right? So the grace of God, or the light, comes from the east and then lands in the west, right? And so that's why the it's like a counterpoint, right? It's the box, right? It's the thing in which the sun goes down into, right? It's the receptacle. It's the feminine, right? So it's the west. And so that's how the first churches were done. And St. Augustine, and I think in other descriptions too, describes that the Christians, what they would do is that during the consecration, I think during the consecration of the elements, the entire church would turn east, and so the priest was already facing east, and then the entire church would turn east and face the east as the transformation was happening, like to receive the oncoming Christ, right? To encounter the Christ. And if you have to remember that in the vision of Ezekiel, it's described that the door that's in the east of the temple, of the third temple, is sealed. And that this seal is the door through which the Messiah will come. It's the door through which the presence of God will come. That's why it's closed and it's sealed. And so the people would turn to face the east and encounter this door that opens, and that would, through which the glory of God would come, right? And so then ultimately what ended up happening is that the Christians decided to turn the entire church the other way, so that it always faced east, so that it always faced the glory of God that was coming. And then the iconography of the church starts to reflect that. So if you go to an Orthodox church, what you'll see is that in the east there's an image of Mary, of the Mother of God, that is there as this gate, the gate in Ezekiel, the sealed gate through which the Messiah will come. So the symbolism becomes both eschatological but also incarnational, kind of at the same time. That's why other churches often, instead of having the Mother of God there with the child, will have the returning Christ, right? The Christ in glory, because you could also represent it that way, which is that here's Christ that's returning, that's coming from the east, and is going to also, you could say, come towards the west. But now the west is us. Right? Now we're the West. We are in some ways those that receive the glory of God, right? We become, you could say, the living temples of the glory. So the symbolism of later Christian churches becomes more complete, you could say, because is able to integrate this transformation that Christ brings in the symbolism of the church. The other thing to notice, and that's very important, is that in the temple and the tabernacle, the altar is in the east, right? So the Ark of the Covenant is in the west, and the altar is in the east, in the sense that it's in the outer court, and the priest will offer up the sacrifices, of the animals in the outer court. And then you can imagine the glory of God comes down in the west. So it's like an exchange. Mathieu talks about that in his book. Whereas, because in Christianity, in the book of Revelation, you see that the center of worship is the altar, right? So the center of worship becomes the place on which the lamb is placed, and it's around the altar that the procession is happening. And so there's this really interesting transformation. And then what happens in Christian symbolism is that it all kind of gets fused together, which is that we have the altar, which is also the Ark of the Covenant, and which is the place on which the glory kind of descends from above, and then gets transmitted out to us who also receive it, also being in some ways the living temples and little arks of the covenant. And obviously this is some of this stuff is not described in the text. I'm in some ways speculating from the fact that the meaning of the fact that Christians did flip the churches, and it's only in Rome that you find these early Western-facing churches. So hopefully that's helpful. All right. All right. So Graham Taylor for $20. Thank you for that. Hi, Jonathan. I love your work. My wife and I are expecting a girl in July. We're considering the name Isla or Isla, which means island in Spanish, from what I understand. So we are wondering, what is the symbolism of an island? And so, I mean, the symbolism of an island is the idea of a world, right? That's the way of understanding an island, is that it's a full world. It has the waters around it, and then it has, in order for it to be outside of the waters, it has to be somewhat, like, there has to be a verticality to it because it has to be outside the waters, and so it's like a little mountain that is surrounded by water and has its own its own kind of independent existence to some extent. And to me, that's the way that I kind of understand what the symbolism of an island is. All right. So Carl Christian Roberts 6886 for 35 ZAR. I don't know what that is. ZAR. What's the symbolic significance of naming space rockets and lunar missions after fallen pagan deities? Um there are two things going on. I think for sure, the Christians didn't completely forget their connection to the ancient stories. And so if you read Dante, for example, you will find references to Apollo that are negative, right? That is, that he is this pagan deity, but you also find references to Apollo which seem to be pointing to God himself, which seem to be in some ways showing in some of the positive elements of these ancient stories how they are reflections of the true God. And so this is something that you can't avoid. You'll find it all over, medieval Byzantine classical thinking, which is this interplay between the two, which is, on the one hand, this is an incomplete and kind of pagan fallen thing, but on the other hand, it also has to have some glimmer of the truth and of the true God. Um, and so why is it that we tend to name that? I think for sure there's a kind of hubris in that gesture, which is, we're going into the heavens, we are replacing the gods. Um, that's for sure is something that I tend to think. And also, there's something, of course, in the Enlightenment and kind of Enlightenment thinking, which is trying to use pagan symbolism to supplant Christian symbolism again. So you see that all through the Enlightenment. You see it in Napoleon, and you see it in these kind of, you see it in the Age of Reason. People will tend to refer more to the pagan deities than, of course, to the saints, because they're trying to use paganism to supplant Christianity again. And they have a kind of nostalgia for the ancient classical world. You meet people like that all the time, still alive today. I've friends that I would say are probably kind of like that, where, they're kind of Christian, but what they really wish we still had was, was Athens, in the times of Plato. So, there's that too. All right, so two more V's. Jonathan, when do you finally announce the next Symbolic World Summit? We've been waiting for so long, dude. And so Marvin was there at the Symbolic World Summit. It was great to see him, and his and his girlfriend was there with him, which was great to meet her as well. I don't know. I mean, we're probably going to do it again because it was so much fun. For sure, we are going to do a kind of mini Symbolic World Summit in September in Oxford. And so if you're in Europe or if you want to travel, it's going to be pretty cool. Like there's going to be some really cool people. Think of all the British people that are kind of around the Symbolic World Summit, around the Symbolic World, and hopefully we'll have as many as we can who will be there. So I think it's going to be a pretty fun time. All right, so Pierce Richardson says, "Hi, Jonathan. I hope the summit was all and more that you hoped it would be. Over the last few months, I've been thinking about the symbolism of my name and would like to test some of my intuitions with your insight. My name means both to puncture, penetrate, or stab. It also means son of Peter or little stone. Some images of the pierced stone are obviously the sword and the stone from the Arthurian cycle. Durandal, Christ's side being pierced, the cross on Golgotha, and Moses striking the rock. What insight do you have on the symbolism of the pierced stone? It seems to have both feminine and masculine aspects." Well, it depends on, some of these different things are not, so these different aspects aren't the same. For sure, the idea of the sword in the stone is a little different, I think, than, for example, Christ's side being pierced. The sword in the stone has to do with the idea that it's similar to what we talked about in terms of the stag. It's the idea that I can see that there's authority. I can see that there's meaning and purpose. But that purpose or that meaning or that leadership or that authority is only available to the person that can wield it, is only available to the person that can free it from the potential, that can find it in the potential. And so that's why you can imagine like Saint Eustache following the stag, right, in the forest, trying to see where it's going to bring him to some chapel in the woods or something. And so when you have this sword that's stuck in the stone, it's like, I can see that there's something, but I'm not worthy of being able to wield it, that meaning, that authority. So that's for sure, in terms of the sword in the stone, that's what it is. In terms of Christ on the cross and Moses striking the rock, what you're dealing with here is, it's not completely unrelated, but what you're dealing with here is in some ways being able to use that authority in a way that will yield something positive, that will yield creation. And so the Romans pierce Christ's side, and then out of the wound comes the water and the blood, which is understood obviously in some ways as a new Eve, as a birth, as a new creation. It's very, and so or the water that comes down from the garden. And it's the same with Moses. It's like, how are you able to release the potential, right, to make it something that we can use or that we can integrate, So it's not completely unrelated to the other, but it's different. Right, so Mark AK47 for $20 says, "Can you talk about Ascension and iconography? I don't see this aspect of the story talked about as much as the incarnational principle behind images. The ascension of Christ in body seems to be a key as well. Thank you." And so, I just put out a video on decapitation, which you could probably watch, in which I do talk about some aspects of the image of Ascension. When you look at the image of Ascension, at least the icon, for example, of Ascension, what you have is a statement of the ontological relationships, which is, it's telling you that Christ is in heaven, right? Christ is the head. Christ is above. We are his body, and therefore we are. So by Christ going up into heaven, by the head going up into heaven, what it does is it stretches out the body. It makes in some ways, the body clearly see and clearly understand or clearly participate in the headship of Christ. You could say that for many people until the ascension, the headship of Christ was hidden. But once Christ goes up into heaven, then his headship becomes obvious for everyone. They saw him go up. He is above us all. And now we are, coordinating, you could say, coming together as a body, and obviously we still need to receive the Holy Spirit in that sense. But at least that's the way that I see that. But you can watch my video that I did on decapitation, where I talk about the idea of the head being removed from the body. All right, and so let's see. Hi, Jonathan. So Reginald Desrosiers, which is a very Quebecois name. Can you share some practical suggestions on how to create a metaspace on an individual level based on your insights and what Mathieu shared about it in Language of Creation? I think that what Mathieu, he would have to speak for himself, but my basic understanding is that what he's talking about is a kind of space that has integrated the possibility of change, and therefore, for that reason, it has more than it had before, because the very definition of space is the establishing of order, right, of a kind of stable order. But of course, that stable order has a problem, which is the irrational remainder that isn't accounted for by the space, isn't accounted for by the square, and therefore we have to be able to integrate the aspect, this time aspect, this aspect of transformation. And then if you do that, then you kind of have the best of both worlds, right? And so you can see that in terms of, for example, I think that things like gargoyles on the edges of buildings, they're in some ways a way to integrate, to create a meta space, because what they have on the sides of the churches are ambiguous forms. There's ambiguous forms that are represented explicitly on the edge of the building in order to help you understand, and to help you kind of have that as part of you, this kind of ambiguity. And so, in terms of a person, what you need to be able to keep available to you is the capacity to improvise, for example, the capacity to change your plans, the capacity to use change and difference and ambiguity towards the purpose that you have. Because sometimes there are obstacles that present themselves to you that seem to want to stop you from reaching where you are. Well, that's when you can use the power of time, the power of change, the power of ambiguity in order to circumvent, like a snake, these obstacles, so that you can continue to move forward. At least that's the best understanding I have of that. So Norm Grondin says, what do you make of the construction of the railroad from east to west as the founding symbol of the Confederation of Canada? Is it really the founding? I guess. I think it's fine. It's basically connecting. It's saying, just like the Romans, in order to establish the empire, they built roads that would connect things together. I think that's also the case for, obviously, the railway. All right, so back into the super chats. The mayor of Serious Town, 9122 for $10, says, Jordan Hall has commented that AI displacing so much white collar work will eventually force people to find real vocation, not just jobs. What do you think? And how can someone pursue real vocation? For sure, a lot of people will be left hanging. That's 100% sure. But I think that no matter what happens in the next few years with AI, the best thing you can do is do the deep work. The best thing you can do is to integrate the stories, to have wisdom, to have friends, to have people around you, like a real true network of humans surrounding you. No matter what happens, it's those people that will ultimately win, because whether you are able to resist AI or whether you use AI in its positive way, it's only those that have that inside them that will be able to get there. And so, the idea of having a job and just kind of having a 9 to 5, this is a very short time in history where this has existed. It's not like this is a normal permanent thing about human existence, and it's possible that it'll just go away. And so people that have a true project, the people that have a vision for what they want to do and how they want to participate in the world, then those will have an advantage over people that just want to do a 9 to 5 and then go home and rest, because those jobs are possibly going to vanish. So Peter 9638 says, talking to Joe Foley, you said you were a classical deist. Can you explain what you meant and how it squares with Eastern Orthodox Christianity? And I saw that, I think I'm also mispronounced. I mean, I think sometimes French and English get mixed up in my head. I mean, I probably should have said a basic classical theist, which I think is a category that I feel comfortable using, in the sense that I don't believe that God is a being among other beings. I believe that God is in all of the classical theist positions, whether it's Christianity or Islam or Judaism or let's say Vedantic non-dualism, that God is the unoriginate source of all, that God is both transcends and is present in all things, is both transcendent and immanent in all. That God is. I mean, these are the kind of the classic categories of monotheism, you could say. And so that's the way that I see it. And of course, there are differences. We believe, not all of the classical theistic visions of God will have the Trinity, for example. And so I think the Trinity is the best understanding of the non-dual aspect of God, because we often think that non-dualism only means to transcend duality, but I think that it only means to transcend multiplicity, which I think that's a limited vision of non-duality. I think that what's amazing with Christian monotheism is that it's a form of non-duality that both includes an image of how all is one, but then there's also all is dynamic and all is multiple. And these are put in a paradox you can't completely resolve. But I think that is a superior vision of non-duality than the one you see in other forms of monotheism. So, yeah, and I also think the same thing with the essence and energy distinction that Christians have. That other monotheistic traditions or monotheistic systems, or like Neoplatonic systems, for example, don't necessarily have. And I think that this distinction between essence and energies makes it possible for multiplicity to not just be an illusion, for the creation to not just be a kind of remove from God, but that God can both be fully present in all things and at the same time completely transcend them, without saying that his presence in everything is somehow a reduction of his being, which is something you see in kind of Hindu systems or some Gnostic or Neoplatonic systems that try to talk about these things. So hopefully that helps to understand what it is, and I'm not a theologian, as you know, so obviously I'm not I'm not the best at formulating these concepts about God. So ADL 1998 for $10 says at 9.99 says, "Hey Jonathan, God bless you. Is there any connection between Judas and the tribe of Levi? Any significance of the Levites not being promised an inheritance of land and Judas giving up his inheritance?" I'm not sure what you mean by giving up his inheritance. You mean giving up the price of Christ, or the fact that he tried to return the coins? Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by Judas and the tribe of Levi. So, and for sure, there's a significance of the Levites not being promised land, is that they are, they're meant to be more spiritual, right? They're closer to heaven, and therefore they are both. They don't have their own land, but they're also distributed all through the land of Israel, right? So they're Levites that live all through the land. I think that that's also a good way of understanding why the Levites are that, right? They're in the tabernacle in the middle, or in the temple, but then they're also distributed all through the other lands and all through the other tribes. Joel Kim says, "Hey Jonathan, would you talk a little bit about what is glory and its relationship to love?" Its relationship to love. I mean, glory is that of you which is found outside of you. That's really the only kind of way that I can kind of understand what glory is. It's your radiance, right? And so it's like there's you, and then there's what you emanate, what comes out of you. And that's why there's a relationship between glory and your actions, right? So the things you do in the world, they reflect you in the world. They are an aspect of your glory. The things you possess, and this is not in a Christian way, or it could even be in a pagan way. The things you possess are like an aspect of the glory. They show your breath, like how much you have an impact in the world. The things that you build, and so people would name buildings after themselves in order for their glory to be seen by others, right? The effect that they're having in the world. And that's why, there's a relationship. That's why in scripture, for example, it says that a man's wife is his glory. Why? Because she's the one that is not him, but extends him out into the world. She has children. She extends his body, right? She makes his presence bigger. And she is also a mirror in which people can see him, right? And so if she's beautiful, if she's well dressed, if she's at peace, if people will see their husband, they'll say, "Oh, this is an image of their relationship. It's an image of the husband." And so this idea that your spouse is like your glory, right? And I think that that's really the way that I kind of understand glory. But then, there's this mysterious thing that happens in Christianity, which is that the way you suffer also becomes your glory, because it's in some ways people acting on you from the outside are, if you suffer well, it's like a flip where they are becoming affected by your suffering, right? They are in some ways being transformed by your suffering. And that can be imaged as, like the effusion of blood, the blood that if someone pierces you and your blood comes out, then that can be your glory. That ultimately dying, because it is in some ways how you become not yourself, right? That's dying. Dying is the mode in which you stop being yourself, right? You let go. You kind of, and the surprise, I think, in Christianity is how that can become your glory. And so that's why the martyr, his death is his glory. And so what's its relationship to love? I mean, it's probably I've never thought about this. First time that I think about this. I mean, probably, at least from a Christian point of view, we'd probably see that your glory is actually an image of your love. That is the true glory, not that artificial glory, the glory of naming a building after yourself or doing that kind of thing. That to extent that you love someone, that you pour yourself out into them, then your glory shines through them, not in a selfish way, right? In a self-emptying way. And that this is maybe the surprise, right? That if you die to yourself and you die for others, then that love appears as glory in them, right? And kind of reproduces itself in them. So, yeah, that's my take on that. All right, so Kevin Hertzler 7662, can you describe a personality that Jesus may be like? I was brought up with a Jesus loves me notion, but learning and reading more, he was direct and wild. Yeah, he was everything, and that's the thing about Jesus, that he doesn't have a personality the way that we think about it. At least that's my sense, is that he in some ways seems to be a kind of encompassing of all of these different aspects of the world. That's why people can have different images of him, because you could follow in line in scripture um, where it's him just accusing other people and being extremely unpleasant in public, like a true gadfly for others. And you can trace this other line where he's this kind, gentle man who received little children, who heals the sick, and so the fullness of Christ is probably difficult to describe except for his own story. There's no category outside of him that can explain what personality he has. Yeah. All right, so Just Edua for 4.99 says, can you explain the symbolism of the engagement before marriage and the purpose of it? I mean, I never thought about this. There's probably something to do with a kind of preparation time, just kind of like if you're going to receive communion, you have to do certain things to prepare yourself. That it's a kind of time where you detach yourself from others, where you prepare your home, you prepare the place where you're going to go. You don't just get married, you have nowhere to go. You have this time where you plan out how it's going to happen, and in that way you have to detach yourself slowly from your parents, detach yourself from your friends. Like I said, prepare your nest, know where you're going to live, have enough objects, have the things you need to be able to live with your spouse available, and that takes time to be able to do that. So that's kind of, I think, what I see. It's like a pruning of your old life, a time of pruning of your own life, a time of gathering for the life that's about to start. Part of it would be like gathering a body, right? So maybe you can, have a place to stay. Where are you going to stay in an apartment? Are you going to get your own house? Not anymore, but let's say in the past, you're going to get your own house. You're going to build something to receive your bride. The same with the woman. She needs to make sure she has gather the dowry, gather the things, the pots, the pans, the things for the house, all the things that the woman used to bring to the house. And I think that that's what the time of engagement was for. So you can kind of understand the symbolism that way. It's like a preparation of pruning and of gathering, so that then the union can happen and there's a proper body to receive it. I mean, you can imagine like a very simple one would be like, we don't think this way. Like, we'll just go to a hotel. But in the ancient world, it's like, well, you need a marriage bed, What is the marriage bed going to be? You're not going to sleep in your parents' bed. Like, you're not going to, which bed, like, what is going to be your wedding bed? What is going to be the bed that you're going to live your life in? You have to prepare that. and all these other things that you kind of have to prepare. All right, so Connor Mitchell says, I recently discovered the Saxon poetic work, the Heliand, framing the gospel in terms of warriors' loyalty to his liege lord. Most commentaries simply framed it as a syncretic work meant to convert pagans, a take which I found annoying and lazy. Wondering your thoughts on the work, the idea of Christ being presented in such ways, and what the proper boundaries are. Thanks. Yeah, I don't think that you can reduce it to a syncretic work. I think that you, to some extent, have to understand it as a people receiving the story of Christ and then trying to fit it with their world, trying to make it coherent to the people that live in those people. So it's as much for the, yeah, maybe for the pagans that hear it for the first time, but even for the Christians trying to kind of digest this wild and new type of storytelling. We have that in our, it's not just in a Saxon vision, in the image of the descent into Hades, we have exactly this. We're saying, here's what's happening on the cross, which is Christ is giving himself and emptying himself. But here's what's secretly happening, which is that Christ is conquering death. He's coming down, breaking the doors open, going in, invading death, taking everybody out. And so it's not just in the Saxon vision, it's already there in the normal Christian understanding of Pascha. And so I would say that, maybe there are mistakes in it in the sense that maybe there's excesses, it's possible. But that's what I would think of it as, a kind of working out of Christianity. What's its relationship to the victory that it brings, and what's the relationship between the crucifixion and the more victorious element of Christ? Who's described in the book of Revelation as, ruling with a rod of iron, and his rule will never end, and he submits all the nations to him. So all right, so Samuel Ramalera says, hi, Jonathan. Recently been seeing some about David Bentley Hart's book, Experience of God, Being, Consciousness, Bliss. What's your view on those three aspects of God? First of all, I think that it's a great book. I think David is definitely one of the best philosophers. I think he's one of the people that is able to help secular people understand what it is that we're talking about when we talk about God. And yes, it is of course related, in modern terms, to our experience of being and consciousness. And bliss, it's not that I tend to talk a lot about being and consciousness. If you watch any of my videos, you'll see. I think that for sure bliss is not, I would tend to say beauty, but I think bliss is probably close in some ways to that kind of experience of numinous, when all of a sudden everything kind of falls into place and you have this kind of wondrous experience. So, I would tend to say beauty, but I think that I'm pretty sure, knowing David's thought, that this is close to what he, and I have read it, but I read it a while ago. I probably have to read it again. All right, I'm kind of running out of juice here. So Nectarios on the Symbolic World Summit says, during your monks and pirates discussion, there's one thing I would have loved to hear you guys talk about, which is the pirate shanty. They're working songs where the timing, rhythm, call response, etc., are all specifically structured to coordinate a specific task between multiple people across the ship, such as raising of sails. Do you have any thoughts on this? That's a super interesting example. I don't think I've ever thought about it. But I remember seeing scenes in movies where you see that, right? Where they're singing and then they're doing the work, and so then, like you said, it's as if they know when to pull, they know when to push, because they're just following the rhythm of the song. Yeah, it's great insight. Great insight. But I mean, I've never really thought about it. It's a good, it's definitely a good idea for sure. I think that work songs, that's what they're kind of for. It's also not just work songs, but people who listen to music to train, for example, or to run. You have a rhythm, and you can kind of follow the rhythm. The rhythm doesn't come from within you. You can in some way submit to a rhythm that is outside you, and it makes it less of an effort to just kind of go along with the flow. All right, let's see here. I think I'm almost pretty much feeling done here. All right, so not the name, no name 23 for $10 says, can you please explain vertical causality? The term has been used a lot lately, and I'm not sure I understand exactly what it means. How does it differ from horizontal causality? So there are different types of vertical causality. I just kind of clumped them all in one you could say system. And so there's actually there's several, right? It's like there's the you could call it formal cause of something is a type of vertical causality, which is the manner in which an identity causes something, right? The manner in which, when you realize what identity something is submitting to, how does that cause? So you can't get that from calculating all the things, how they're there. You can only get it by intuiting and seeing that all of these elements are actually united in one identity that I recognize. I see it's an apple. I see it's a hammer. I see, it's a tree, and that's its formal cause, right? It's the identity that how it acts on another. Of course, there's this idea of the purpose, right? The final cause, or what the purpose of something is. That is also a type of a vertical cause, right? Which is that, and that's more in the human level too, which is influence, right? Influence is a vertical cause. If I grab scissors, and I put them here, I've manifested my influence on the scissors. There's a vertical cause in that sense. If I tell someone what to do, if I ask my wife to bring me water, you won't be able to find in how the molecules bump next to each other. And if you quantify all the things that happen, right, in terms of her moving, you'll never be able to find my will in there. My will, which is requesting that she move things around in order to let's say, accomplish my will. That's a vertical cause. So hopefully that makes sense. That's the difference. So horizontal causes are something like, as like a good example would be, and it's all relative. Like, it's fractal, because there is no absolute horizontal cause, right? And the only absolute vertical cause is God. And so everything is relative. But if you think about it this way, right? So if you see me like get in the car, start the car, drive it, and you see all of these causes, right? I'm turning the steering wheel, I'm pressing on the gas, I'm doing all these things, and you can see what's going on. You can calculate them. You can see how fast I'm going. You can measure, how much distance I've crossed. You can do all of these measurements, and they'll be accurate. But in all of those measurements and all of those horizontal causes, like, you'll never know that I'm going to visit my mother at the hospital because she's sick and because I love her, right? I love my mother, and she's sick. I'm going to visit her at the hospital. If you calculate how many miles I've gone and in how the gears turn in the car and all of that, you'll never find the reason why all these things are happening. And so I think that's the ultimate, it's the easiest way of kind of understanding what it is that we mean by vertical cause. So, all right, two more of the super chats, and then I will be done. John Anon MH5EL for $5. What is the symbolism of Saint Seraphim Rose and his influence on the modern world? Coincidence that Disclosure Day films coming out at this time? No, I do think that for sure the fact that Father Seraphim Rose is becoming a saint, and I think it's pretty much been accepted at this point, although there are dissenting voices. It's in some ways like a perfect moment, because he's a convert. He also transformed, right? Being very kind of radical at the outset and very, very strict at the outset, but then learning in some ways to expand as he moved forward. And in some ways, for us, for the people that are converts, it's like a promise. It says, well, you can all be Orthodox. We can all, if we live a life of prayer and dedication to God, that we can reach, then we can move into the same directions as any of the other saints that are in the church. So, and I do think also that his warnings about the religion of the future and of aliens and all that is also not arbitrary, that he was right in talking about these things. So, All right, so Joe Mackley, 2017 says, thank you for all your work. My children love your reimagining of Jack and the Beanstalk. I recently started the gospel series on Daily Wire. Can you reflect on the use of the summarized gospel? Yeah, that was a little bit of an issue because we didn't totally understand that that's what we were doing. The people that were part of the seminar, we thought we were actually going to go through the gospels, and then when we started the actual event, we're reading through, and they would give us like a reference, and then we reading through the reference, and then I get lost. And I was like, what's going on? Like, why am I lost? And then Jordan would read another verse, and I'm like, well, wait a minute, it's not here. And it took me like several hours on the first day to realize that, wait a minute, this is not, like, I thought that what we would have was something like, we're basically going to go through the events of the life of Christ and use different gospels, at least to go through. But this summarized gospel is different. It's like this, basically, sometimes it sticks verses together and it does these weird things. And so I think several of us were a little worried about that. And I think with good reason, but that's how they decided to do it. And in the end, I think it still covers the basics of course, of Christ's life. It covers all the stories and, enough of the miracles and the parables to kind of at least be able to. But I just wish that, I think, it just wasn't very clear to us at the outset, but, so, it's 50-50, I would say. So, all right, everyone. I'm done. I always get tired after about an hour and a half, and so thanks everyone for showing up. It's always a joy. I'm really enjoying these public Q&As, and so I think we're going to keep doing those for at least a little while. I'll see you soon. I'll see you in a month. Thanks everyone, and bye bye.